Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to answer a question about Plasticity Xnurbs versus Loft. And so the question came in, if we have access to Xnurbs, should we always use that instead of lofting, or is there a reason why we'd still use Loft? And so if you have the studio version of Plasticity and you have access to Xnurbs, we're going to walk through we're going to walk through the patch tool, the Loft tool, and the Xnurbs tool in this one specific case. It's not all cases, but in this one specific case, which is like ideal for Loft, and highlight the different surfaces that you get with each tool and some of the different inputs. So we're going to hopefully clear some of that up. The short answer is no. Xnurbs is not a direct replacement for Loft because they fundamentally behave a little bit different. There are some nuances to how the Xnurbs tool works that gives it more flexibility to create a nice high quality surface and use some of the inputs that you give it as more of a loose guideline than an actual fixed constraint. Keep in mind, if you're on like a 14-day trial of Plasticity, that is essentially a restricted version of Indie, so you won't have access to Xnurbs to play with. If you are in a studio license, you will have Xnurbs, and you can try this out for yourself. If you are looking to buy, we are an affiliate. You can use the code LEAD10 at checkout. That'll save you 10%. It does help out the channel. Another quick note, I'm not on the most current version of Plasticity. I'm on 25.3.4 is out now, which has some cool new tools like instancing. I haven't covered those yet. If you're looking for content on that, Peter at Take Refuge 3D released a video recently on that. And he also covered it in the beta version of the software. So if you have a studio license, you get access to sort of pre-release versions, which I personally don't install. I just kind of wait till the final version comes out. But he's got a couple videos on that. Looks like a pretty cool tool. I haven't really had a chance to play with it yet, but we will get to that in the near future. All right, so let's get started. Let's first talk about patch. So the patch tool requires us to have a closed boundary. And so this means that all four sides, in this case, it doesn't have to be four, but in our case, all four sides need to connect. And then when we patch, it'll use those. If it's a curve like this, we don't have any direct input for continuity. But if we have an edge, so for example, from a surface, we can say G1 or G2 continuity. Now, you'll get an error here for G2 because the curve on this edge was created with G1 continuity, not G2 continuity. So that comes up both in this case, but as well as Loft and Xnurbs. The definition of your curves, whether it's G1 or G2, or in some cases G3, needs to match or be greater than the definition you're trying to use for your surface. Now, one downside of the patch tool is that we can't really use these internal guides. If I click on, let's say, this one here, it tells me it's not supported for this specific case. So that is a case where this is going to be a very different surface than the others. Another quick note on this, when you use the patch tool, it will automatically join it to the rest of the surfaces that you use for input. So you'll need to use tools like unjoin, which is Alt and J, to break it back apart from that. All right. So what we're going to do now, so we've got our input surfaces here. We have got our curve network here. Let's talk about the Loft tool. And so one fundamental difference between things like the patch and the Loft tool is that the Loft tool is essentially working on these profiles, which are going to be what we're going from, going through, and then going to. We can optionally have guide rails, so these will be our guide rails here, to control where the boundary of the surface is, but they're not required. And so let's just say we go from this end to this end and we loft. It's L on the keyboard. You'll notice that these are essentially straight across. G1, G2 is not really going to make any difference here, but this creates a surface that goes from that edge to this edge. Now, if we wanted to include these in the middle, we need to select them in order, and then we can hit L to loft, and again, G1, G2 continuity, we can do that. Now, if you take a look at these guides, you'll notice there's a small gap between them. And what this tells me is that the surface that we created, the version that has the least amount of tension in the surface, does not match up with the guide rail that I want to use. So this tells me that as soon as I start to include these, it's going to start stretching or pulling that surface out. So let's go ahead. I'm going to hold down Shift to select multiples, right click and say OK. And so now what we've done is we've created a lofted surface that goes from our start point to our end point, perfectly goes through the intermediate curves that we created, and it's bound by those outside edges, which are essentially our guides. And so I'm going to go ahead and rename this Loft with Guide. I'm going to hide it, and then I'm going to do this again. And so I'm going to go, again, the same 4 profiles here, L to Loft, G1 continuity, and right-click to accept. And so this version, you can see, does not match up with that boundary, that guide rail. And so the main difference that we want to talk about here is how far off or how much difference is there between these two. And so if I take the Loft with the guide rail, and let's change its color to red, turn on render mode, you can see that the one with the guide rail, it's higher here, it gets lower here, it's higher there. The one without the guide rail, where it kind of goes where it wants to, you can see that it's higher in this spot, higher there, and then it's higher again back here. And so these are not identical surfaces. They're relatively close. You probably never notice a difference between them if you were just looking at a model that had, this one versus this one, other than the color, obviously, in this case. But you probably wouldn't ever notice a difference here. So when we get to the Xnurbs tool, what does that look like for us in terms of how these surfaces are created? Well, the Xnurbs tool, Xnurbs is its own program, or it's an add-in essentially for a lot of different CAD packages, and it's licensed and included directly in Plasticity, which is great. It is a tool that can create really complex surfaces with inputs, and we have things like tolerances that we can toggle on or off to create very high quality curvature continuous surfaces. But we have to keep in mind that it takes some of these internal rails that we're going to be using as loose guides. And so let's start from the outside. I'm going to select these 2 outsides, and I'm going to go to my Xnurbs tool. So if I say G1 continuity, just like we've used on the others, in this case, it's essentially straight across. You'll notice that it's actually pulling up and then coming back down. We've got some options for the boundary. So for example, we can say natural or normal or next or adjacent, and these will have an impact depending on your input edges as well as any intermediate curves. For this example, we also wanted to go through some curves in the middle. So if I select this, hold down Shift and select this one as well, one big thing you're going to note that's different from our Loft that didn't have our guides is the surface is actually extending past our curve. Now with the Loft, that's not how it works. It goes exactly through the curve that you create. So with the version of Xnurbs here, which we're not using the boundary to define it, we're just using the start and ends, it is actually giving it the ability to sort of expand that surface. There are a lot of other tools in here, like we can turn on and off satisfy tolerances, so we can basically give it a range and say, we need you to be within this range. And so if I reduce this tolerance here, I guess it just did away with it. Let's go ahead and redo that. So G1, we want it to hit this one and hit this one. And so if we change this tolerance, what's going to end up happening is it's going to create more internal UV divisions to get closer or allow it to get further away from those tolerances. And again, we can turn on and off those tolerances, giving it essentially a more freedom to create this. And I'll try to, I'm not sure if I can even show this, but let's try to rotate this. There we go. That's a good shot. So you can see here the surface, let's pull that up. The surface is well below that curve. But when we turn back on satisfy tolerances, it goes back up and it hits and goes through that curve. And so this is a case where the inputs are exactly the same, but the outputs are different. So I'm going to right click to accept that. I'm going to rename that X, no boundary. And then we'll do this again with the boundary. And so very similar to how the patch tool works, we can give it a complete closed boundary. We can, again, G1 continuity. And again, we can include these internal rails, which is something we can't do with the patch tool. And now it's going to restrict the shape to that closed boundary. It's not going to grow outside of that anymore. And again, it's going to hit these based on our tolerance settings. If we say don't worry about the tolerances, you can see it actually comes away from this boundary curve. You can actually see it comes away from the surface edge here. And it's doing this to create the surface that has the least amount of tension. And so you have to be careful with this, because then when you try to join these surfaces together, they need to be healed and they're going to move, and it's not going to be curvature continuous across there. So it's generally a good idea to leave the satisfy tolerances on. and allow it to hit all of the curves that you've created. One big thing I see, I get questions, not just in plasticity, but in all different programs, is people trying to create complex surfaces, but driving them with too much control, adding too many curves, adding too many boundaries, adding too many rails. And generally what ends up happening is we create way too much tension in the surface. And so like we did before, I'm going to go ahead, let's recolor this one. Let's make this one green and turn on rendering and bring the Xnurbs without the boundary. And you would expect to see this because the outside varied quite a bit, but you can see that we've got the gray one, which is the version without the boundary. You can see that it's kind of higher here, except for right in the middle. And then the version with the boundary is higher in the middle and then kind of splits the difference on the other side. Now, let's hide this one. This is the version that we made with all of the guides, right? So we had the guides, the same exact input for the loft, G1 continuity, complete boundary, follow these profiles, hit these curves in the middle. And you can see they're not the same, all right? So there is a slight difference here. There is a high spot in green, which is the Xnurb surface here. And it does change when we rotate around. They're relatively close. They're not perfect. They're not exactly the same, but they're relatively close. But you can see that it's not exactly the same. So I guess what I would say here is if you're trying to loft something and you need it to be exactly what you define, right? You're starting from this input curve, you need to exactly go through these intermediate curves, and you're ending at this surface over here, and you've got a boundary for guides or profiles, then you want to think about using a loft because it's going to give you, I don't necessarily want to say a more accurate result, but the surface is going to be closer to your defined curves. Now, if you want to get the best quality surface and you are able to be a little bit more lenient on some of those different areas, then maybe the Xnurbs tool is going to be a good option for you. Now, this is all to say, and I'm going to go ahead and hide these curves here, but this is all to say that this is one very specific use case for using the Xnurbs tool. Now, the Xnurbs tool doesn't just work on four-sided patches, but I use that as an example because that's really where Loft shines. And that's also where we can use tools like Patch, except for with those two internal guide rails. So it's important to note that the Xnurbs tool, and I'm going to go ahead and just launch it here. The Xnurbs tool can work with all sorts of different inputs. And I'm going to go ahead and set this to G1 and even come down to this one. And so what we have when we're trying to use the Xnurbs tool is the ability to have inputs, whether they're curves or whether they're edges of surfaces in 3D space, and we can use those to help drive a shape without having to have all of the closed profiles. We don't have to have all of our rails connect, and this is a way that we can really benefit from using something like Xnurbs. Now, there is another aspect to this. Let me go ahead and just create a simple arc, and just create one right here. Relatively large, but let's go ahead and use the Xnurbs tool again. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an Xnurbs surface, and then I'm going to try to use this as an input. And so you can see what's actually happening. Let's go ahead and let's remove that. And let's go ahead and select it as a guide. And what it tries to do is it tries to push or build that surface up to match that guide, which is, again, just a curve in space that's not touching anything. And it's giving it the ability to try to build out the surface. And again, if we turn off satisfy tolerances, it kind of gets a little loose on all of the inputs. It still drives tangency and does those kinds of things, but it really does not meet the requirements that we would expect from a surface connecting to other surfaces. Now, in this case, we could use G2 continuity because we don't have any extra guides that are coming in here or whatever the case might be. And another thing you can always do is you can try to use things like bridge curve. And so we could go from, let's say, maybe there to there. This one is going to be, say, G2 continuity. And we can include this. We can just go ahead and I'm going to add these and go to Xnurbs. We can include that if we want to drive our surface to go in there. And we can say G2 because that curve has G2 continuity. And then we can add this guide in the middle, again, trying to build this sort of weird complex shape in 3D space. So really, Xnurbs is a powerful tool. It has a lot of flexibility, a lot of benefit when you're trying to build these complex surfaces that aren't really constrained in the same way as, say, a loft or a sweep or a revolve or an extrude would be, because you have the ability to just kind of create curves that you want to roughly guide the shape, and then you can also define it in all sorts of other ways. And so let's say I want this curve to kind of come up here, maybe rotate it a little bit. Let's rotate it this way, and then bring that down. And then once again, I'm going to select all these edges, go to Xnurbs, and include this. Let's go ahead and make a G2 continuity and include that. And so once again, just playing around with it, adding these extra curves and shapes and getting a shape in 3D. This is not something that you could do with a patch tool, with a loft tool, or with any other surface tool without having a very strict guide of rails and profiles and things to make that happen. So hopefully that helps. I know I've had lots of comments on more plasticity content. We are sort of working on the outline for a new course. We've got the one course, which at this point was in version 24, on learneverythingaboutdesign.com. We are also working on more content ideas for an Xnurbs based course. And so we did the playlist for the concept car series and plasticity that did not use Xnurbs. And we're planning on doing something, again, not an entire car again, but something similar where Xnurbs really shine. So if you have a studio license and you're looking for Xnurbs content, we'll be working on that in the near future. But if you have any questions on this or anything else in plasticity, please leave a comment and let me know. As always, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.